Hey guys, it's Christa Watson here, and for this week's machine quilting video, I want to dive deep and talk to you a little bit more about this version of my Terrace tiles quilts made from my stitchy fabrics. Now this pattern, Terrace Tiles, is one of my go-to favorites. In fact, it's the easiest quilt pattern that I've designed. So if you're a brand new beginner, I recommend starting with this one. The pattern itself comes in several different sizes and it's made completely from fat quarters. For this size, which is one of the larger sizes, I used 25 fat quarters. I used my Stitchy fat quarter bundle, which comes with 25 fat quarters. 20 of the fat quarters are used for the colorful prints, and then 5 light background prints are used for each of the individual little strips in between. It's that little light colored strip that creates the magic and the sparkle in this quilt. So that's the first tip I'm going to tell you now. When you're trying to pull fabric colors, pull colors that you like. No rhyme, no reason, just a smattering of fun, scrappy goodness. And then make sure you pair those colors up with a highly contrasting fabric for this little middle section. So if you're using bright, colorful prints like me, a light or low volume print works wonderfully. On the other hand, if you're using lighter prints or maybe pastels, you can go with a darker strip for that little piece, and that's what's going to set it apart. Now, in this particular quilt, I did an all-over edge-to-edge free motion design called boxes. Here's a little secret. Every time I make a quilt, I love playing around with one of my free motion designs or walking foot designs just to see how that quilt is going to look stitched out with a different pattern. So I recommend trying out a bunch of my patterns. You can check out my books. You can mix and match all of the designs that I put out there because they're really fun to play around with. So let's dive in and take a look, and let me share some more tips and tricks of making this version of my Terrace Tiles quilt. So here are all of my pretty pieces cut out according to the pattern instructions. Now let me share a couple of piecing tips as I'm putting this together. I am using a 1/4 inch foot meant to fit my machine, and a stiletto helps me guide the pieces under the machine. On my machine, I have what's called the hover feature engaged so that the foot slightly pops up each time I'm adding more pieces. This makes it much easier for assembly line sewing. Then when I add the next piece of the block, the skinny strip is going to stay on top. Now you'll notice I'm sewing with the skinny strip on top each and every time. This is going to allow me to reverse the sewing direction each time I add the pieces without having to think about it. So basically when I'm sewing the 2 pieces, the skinny strip goes on top. This prevents warping of the blocks so everything lies nice and flat. So if you just remember to sew with the skinny strip on top every time with these blocks, you'll have no problems. Now, the pieces are pre-cut to size ahead of time so that they're going to line up. I don't have to use pins yet, but I will later on. Now, one tip that comes in handy is when I'm stitching, I'm actually sewing with a shorter stitch length. My default is 2.5, but I've turned that all the way down to 2.0, and I'll tell you why in just a moment. I also start and end a bunch of blocks by using what's called leaders and enders. These are small little scraps of fabric that I sew onto at the beginning of chain piecing and also at the end of chain piecing. So here's why I want nice small stitches in my seams, because I'm going to press my seams open. So I'm pressing with a hot, dry iron and no steam. After I've used my finger to open up that seam a little bit, I'm going to come back with the iron and press it from the back side nice and flat. Then I'm going to flip the block over to the front side and give it another press on top. Now here's a speedy version of me putting all of my finished blocks on the design wall. You can check out links to my blog tutorial showing how I made this design wall. I use it for everything. Laying out my blocks, photography, even basting. It really comes in handy. And so I'm just putting them out in a pleasing order, and then I'm ready to stitch the whole thing together. Once my blocks are sewn into rows, it's now time to join the rows, and in this case I will use pins. I pin on either side with the pins perpendicular so that I can pull them out as I stitch. And once my quilt top is all ready and finished, I'm ready to baste. You can see on the back side, all those nicely pressed seams open, so this quilt is going to be nice and flat. I've actually made a pieced backing with lots of leftover chunks of fabric because I didn't want to use just any one fabric. I wanted to use kind of my leftovers. And sometimes I'll leave the selvages on to add a little bit of extra whimsy. All right, now I'm ready to baste the quilt. So first of all, I'm taking my quilt top and I'm turning it wrong side up, and I'm doing this outside in a well-ventilated area. Then I'll use a can of 505 spray and I'm going to spray all sides of the quilt top, fold it up and set it aside. I'm going to repeat this process for the quilt backing, whether it's a single fabric backing or a pieced backing. The nice thing about a pieced backing is I can see the different sections, so that can help me keep track of which area I've spray basted or not. I'm going to take the backing, fold it up, and bring both of the layers inside to assemble on my design wall. So there's my design wall again, and don't worry, the quilt backing is kind of stuck to itself, but it easily pulls apart and the stickiness doesn't get all over the place. You can just wash your hands. The weight of the quilt backing is going to pull it down and kind of work out any wrinkles. Don't worry, if there's wrinkles left over, I'll show you how to deal with that in the end. Once the quilt backing is on the design wall, I take a separate long acrylic ruler that I use just for basting and I smooth it all out. So once it's all smoothed out, I'm going to grab my piece of batting that I cut that's a little bit bigger than my quilt top but smaller than my backing, and I'm going to repeat the process. I take my piece of batting, pin it up, smooth it all out with my hands, smooth it all out with the ruler. And even if the batting's a little bit bigger than the backing, that's okay too. The important thing is you want it to be bigger than your quilt top and you don't want to waste as much. So I'll just take a few minutes. The whole process takes less than an hour to baste, and it really gets you up close and personal with your quilt so you can make sure it's nice and flat and smooth. Once the backing and batting layers are smooth, now I'm going to take my quilt top and smooth it all out as well using that same ruler. Sometimes I line it up in one corner so that I waste the least amount as possible. I can kind of use the ruler to block the quilt into place and wiggle any seam lines so that they're nice and vertical and horizontal so that my quilt is nice and flat and square. Once it's nice and smooth, I'm going to take my batting scissors and I'm going to trim off around all the sides of the quilt. When I have big chunks of batting left over, like on the side, I will just trim that off and then turn those into little practice samples so that I can practice my machine quilting. Now here's where the magic happens. The final step of my basting process is to iron both sides of the quilt after it has been basted. What I do is I start with the backing and I'm going to iron it all. Again, hot dry iron with no steam. This does two things. Number one, it sets the glue, and more importantly, it gives me a chance to work out any wrinkles or ripples in the quilt. If I find one, I can smooth things out as I need to. After the quilt backing is all nicely pressed, I'm going to flip it over and I'm going to do the same thing on the top. I'm going to smooth out the entire quilt top with the iron. So if I have any wrinkles, I can work them out as needed. Doing this process where I'm pressing on both sides really, again, makes it nice and flat and crisp and smooth. This is going to make machine quilting so much easier. So I'm quilting this with one of the threads from my variegated collection in a really pretty orangey gold color. And I'm going to use the same color thread in the top and bobbin. I'm starting on the right hand side of my quilt, kind of on the upper block of the quilt, and I'm going to bring my bobbin thread up to the top. I'm starting stitching in the batting because this is going to be an edge-to-edge design, so I don't have to worry about tying off my threads. I just kind of ease my way into the quilt and start my design. Now this is free motion where my feed dogs are dropped and I'm controlling how fast or slow I'm going to be stitching. I'm stitching with a busy fabric, so that's one of my tips. If you don't want your quilting to show, quilt on a very busy fabric with blending thread. If you want your quilting to show, stitch on fabric where you're going to see it. All right, here's a close-up where you can actually see the design a little bit better. This modern boxes design, it's just a series of squares and rectangles crossing over my previous lines. Now I'm stitching at actual speed, and I've had requests to leave the sound of the sewing machine on, so I will do that for just a little bit of time so you can kind of hear what it sounds like and see me moving. A couple of tips I will share with you. Like I said, this is stitching right now at actual speed. I'm wearing my Christa Quilt gloves, and they have little grippy dots that help hold onto the quilt so that I can push the quilt under the machine. When I'm doing walking foot quilting, I don't need as much strength because the feed dogs are pulling the quilt through. However, when the feed dogs have been lowered like they are for free motion quilting, there's nothing pulling the quilt through, so I have to put a little elbow grease into it. I have to push very smoothly, very cleanly, very evenly so I can get a nice stitch. And honestly, all I'm going to tell you about free motion is it just takes practice. Practice doesn't make perfect, but practice makes progress. So I am just focusing on one block area at a time, using the area in between my hands as sort of a hoop, and I'm only focusing on that area. Now, the way that I like to quilt is I'm going to start on the right hand side of the quilt, stitch one block at a time, and I'm quilting my meandering boxes design in any direction. I want to show you something else that sometimes happens. Sometimes if you run out of thread or you break a needle, and sometimes you have to start stitching before you reach the edge of the quilt. So in this case, I will just bring up my bobbin thread to the top, and I'm going to stitch on top of a previous line of stitching to lock my threads in place, and then I'm going to stitch for a little while. Once I've stitched kind of out of the way of my thread, I will go back and clip off both of those threads. By bringing the bobbin thread to the top, it makes it a lot easier to cut off those extra threads. Now, it's kind of a bummer that I was so close to the end. I'm not sure if I ran out of bobbin or what had happened. Maybe my machine came unthreaded, but mishaps like this happen all the time. So now I pulled back so you can see a wider shot of what it actually looks like while I'm quilting this quilt. So here's the pathway that I take when I'm doing an all-over meandering design, such as the modern boxes. I'm starting on the right-hand side of the quilt. From this perspective, you can see that the majority of the quilt is over to my left-hand side, and most of the weight is being held up on my cabinet, lovingly called the Christa Cabinet. Now, I'm only about maybe 2 or 3 rows in from my right-hand side. I'm going up and down and back and forth, focusing on one block area at a time. I can go up and down the quilt side to side, whatever I need to do to get the job done. It doesn't look like I'm accomplishing much, but I'm actually getting a lot done. Now, the angle might be a little bit wonky, but I want to let you know I'm sitting in a very comfortable position. This doesn't hurt my back or shoulders. I've got plenty of room to spread out, and I'm actually sitting very close to the needle so that I can see what I'm doing. So again, I started from the right-hand side, working on one block at a time, one row at a time. Once I get to about the middle of the quilt, I'm going to stitch off the edge, and then I'm going to lift my foot up and rotate the quilt 180 degrees under the machine. That way I can work on the other half of the quilt. So I'm going to start on my next row and continue stitching this meandering design one block at a time. So when I rotated the quilt 180 degrees, I'm basically starting in the middle where I left off. And now everything to my left has been quilted, about half of the quilt, and everything underneath the machine to my right has not been quilted. So as I move and as I meander more and more quilt away from the machine, there's less bulk underneath the machine as I go. This is just an overview. In just a moment, I will show you some more close-up details, but I want you to see what it actually looks like to quilt a large quilt under a machine. Now, the sewing machine that I'm using is the Bernina 770 QE, and I've got 10 inches of throat space under the machine. Before I got my machine that had the nice 10 inches of space, I only had 6 inches of space under the machine, and it's still the same process. If you have more space under the machine, that's less you're going to have to scrunch and smush. Okay, now here's another detail from my perspective, what it looks like while I'm actually quilting. You can see if you look closely that again, everything to my left has been quilted and the area to my right has not yet been quilted, so it's kind of loose, but as I quilt my way across the quilt, I fill in all the gaps. Because this design is stitched edge to edge across the quilt, I'm finishing the quilt as I go. This is a different process that I've explained in other areas where I quilt some areas of the quilt and I go back and fill in. With an all-over free motion design, you're filling in each block as you go. Now I'll show you another close-up so you can again see me form that really fun boxes design. The little gloves are gripping, and really there's maybe only about 5 to 6 inches that I'm focusing on. When I feel like I'm starting to reach, I'm going to stop with my needle in the down position, move my hands, and keep on stitching. I'm just going to continue stitching block by block. This method applies no matter what type of free motion design you're doing. Although I'm doing this fun square box design, you could do a stipple, you could do a swirl, you could do all kinds of different designs using the same motion. Also notice how my hands are flat on my work. My palms are pretty much putting a little bit of pressure and pushing the quilt as I go. Some people like to hold their hands in a different position, and that's completely fine. This is kind of a fun process for me, and it's honestly very relaxing. So I will listen to a podcast or some music and just let myself enjoy the process, filling in one block at a time. Now, if you quilt super dense, you might need more thread, but if you quilt a looser design, you won't need as much thread. Here you can see a little bit of a different angle, kind of more overhead, and you can see how I'm almost done quilting this quilt. I've methodically worked my way block by block, row by row. Again, I only have a little bit of fabric now under the machine. You only have about half the quilt under the machine at any one time. When I start from right to left, I get more and more bulk under the machine. Once I rotate the quilt and I come back the other way, the bulk gets less and less. And now I'm down to the very last block of this quilt. Notice when I get to the edge of the quilt, I've got that batting and backing sticking out. I'm using my hands to kind of hold on to that little bit over there so I can get my foot right up next to the edge. It takes a little practice, but it works really well to get the design all the way across the edges. You can time yourself while you quilt to see how long it's going to take you. Record how long it takes you to stitch one block. Maybe it takes 1 minute, maybe it takes 5 minutes, depending on your design. And then you can kind of multiply that over how many blocks, and that's going to let you know how long it's going to take to quilt this quilt. This meandering design is really fun and looks great on both modern and traditional quilts. It adds an incredible amount of texture, and it's really fun and easy to do. I hope you've enjoyed seeing more of the machine quilting. I wanted you to see what the actual process looks like for a majority of the quilt. The hardest part is probably checking your thread and knowing when to replace your bobbin so you don't run out of bobbin thread right in the middle of stitching. But as I showed earlier, it's okay even when that happens. One other thing I'll say before I end is that I am using an open toe free motion foot so you can see it, and I'm not using a stitch regulator. If you want to, you totally can. That's just going to give you a little bit more control. But again, just practice, and the more you quilt, the better you'll be. One of my #1 tips is to quilt one design over the surface of the entire quilt, and by the time you're done, you're going to be an expert at the design. And you know what? If you don't like the way it turns out, just give the quilt to someone else. They will think it's amazing. So the last bonus tip I'll share with you in making this quilt is how I created my Scrappy binding. I started with a lot of leftover scraps and I cut them into 2-inch strips because I like a really narrow binding. Because they were scrappy and I didn't have a whole lot of length, I sewed the strips along the short edge rather than creating a diagonal miter. This also does another good thing for the quilt. You don't have to worry about shadowing if one fabric is darker or lighter than the other. So I just chain pieced all these little short strips until I had enough fabric to make the binding. Again, I use my leaders and enders whenever I'm doing a whole bunch of chain piecing so that my threads don't make a big mess. And then I clip the binding pieces apart. I'm going to press the seams open and then press the whole thing wrong sides together so it's about 1 inch before I apply it to the quilt. Be sure to check out my other videos for my step-by-step binding process. I mark a line where the two edges meet, and then I cut about 1/2 inch away from that line to make up for the seam allowances. I like to fold my binding over my quilt and secure it with clips, and then I'll hand or machine stitch to finish. Well, I hope you enjoyed that behind the scenes sneak peek. My quilts are soft and supple. They drape very nicely, and I really quilt them densely because I love to hide my machine quilting imperfections. If you have any questions or you need me to help you troubleshoot any part of the quilt making process, I'm here for you. Until next time, happy quilting.